Good morning. We're really glad to have you here today. I have a wonderful panel of experts, and we're going to spend the next 40 minutes talking about the world that we faced over the last year and the lessons we can learn from that we can apply to the future. This isn't going to be a panel where we deeply pontificate about the new normal and and what we think might be there or might not be there. Really, we're going to explore what happened and how we can draw those lessons forward. And so I want to start with my panel members and allow them to introduce themselves. And as they do that, I want them to answer this question. What have they seen as the most significant and difficult security challenge they've faced over the past year? So let me start today with Mark Weatherford.
Hi, Bobby, and thanks for having me on the panel. So I have two answers here. The first is that I left my last full-time job in March of last year, just as COVID was kicking off. And I spent much of the last year traveling around the US in my RV. So my biggest challenge was trying to find good Wi-Fi. And actually, believe it or not, there's actually good Wi-Fi in most places in the United States, even in some really remote locations. But I would say the real challenge that I saw is working with a number of startup companies. They were challenged with basically maintaining the continuity they had with their customer pipeline. So as their customers and large companies began shrinking and contracting to deal with COVID, maintaining the connections and the liaison that the small companies had with the bigger companies became more and more of a challenge as they scrambled to maintain their current pipeline, but still trying to meet their quarterly kind of relationships. So that was a big challenge, and I think it's probably one that's the big companies certainly didn't have to deal with in the scale that the startup company world was dealing with on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's the discrepancies, right? The haves, the have-nots. This was a situation that was felt very differently, I think, by different individuals in this space. Mike, would you care to respond?
Sure. So I'm Mike Brannon. I lead infrastructure and security efforts at National Gypsum. We're a construction materials manufacturer with a couple locations in Canada and a little bit more than 30 locations around the US. We were, in a sense, a little bit fortunate through the pandemic. A lot of the household formation and some of the migration away from the big city office tower stimulated demand for residential construction. So our business kind of took off. In terms of challenges, we've always tried to serve the business and deliver what they needed. And the thing we hit really big time, directly in security, but more broadly across the business, was a lot of unexpected data points, events, shifts that none of us could anticipate. So we're always very much invested in having a plan and working a plan and trying to optimize. This particular year in review, there were just so many different incidents, events, and things that happened where you had to adapt week to week, and you never knew, even from the beginning of a week to the end of the week, how it was going to end up. We started referring to Thursday as hollowed out shell Thursday because frequently, you were running low on resource. But yet our biggest thing was the unprecedented amount of uncertain events that just seemed to happen week to week, day to day throughout the past year.
It's interesting, Mike, because Terry, I'm going to go to Terry next, in an industry that was, I think, really dramatically impacted by the last year. The commonality about that uncertainty, I think, is interesting between yours, where you had demand and not sufficient supply. And Terry, I think we would argue that you had supply and instantaneous loss of demand. Terry, please.
Hi, I'm Terry Griffith. Thanks for that lead in, Bob, because we've had a very interesting year. Obviously, we didn't expect COVID to go quite like this, but we definitely had opportunities, right? And what I mean by that is we have a very loyal customer base. And so we were able to both accommodate future demands and try to maintain what we were doing at the same time. We went into keep the lights on sort of mode. From that, we learned to adapt. We had the Hollow Thursday point. We had never used that name, but I did like that, Mike. And because there was a lot of stress and flexing and moving and adjusting. So we definitely had the opportunities. We had lots of challenges, right? We haven't really sailed since last March, but hopefully this is all winding down now and we start to get back out there and learn from what we've done, right? The adapting piece has been very beneficial. We definitely had some really big wins internally, things that guests may or may not ever see, but things that we've done that we have changed for the better. And so, I'm grateful for that. And I think the company is too. There's an opportunity we took away from it.
That's, I think, really interesting to think about in that way, that the lessons that you're bringing forward can then be applied. In as much as it was a year of really unusual market forces, the unfortunate pandemic activity, I was struck by a sort of a common theme amongst the three of you, that we're used to being a data-driven industry, and that it was really difficult in this environment to be so data-driven and kind of move forward. Was there a particular source that you went to in order to find resources, find data to help you in the planning activity? I mean, cyber events didn't stop as we went forward. I think, in as much as it was the unfortunate year of COVID, it was also the year of ransomware. And so, we were all fighting every day to stay on top of the cyber events that were there.
Yeah, we've leaned hard on all of our partners, and I've really appreciated the network of peers in the community sharing and communicating together about some of this. We built some good connections that served me well on the security front. And, I'm thankful for having made some of those investments a little bit ahead of this event, so that you were a little bit prepared. We were also kind of fortunate. We were shifting our architecture away from a very on-premises environment. We retired a mainframe a year ago. We're shifting much more toward the public cloud for everything we do. And for most of what happened, we shifted our infrastructure and architecture ahead of the pandemic striking. So we were a little bit lucky, maybe. Some might say prescient, I don't know, but that worked well. And then the network of partners and peers has been great. Even though we've all been kind of stuck at home and not able to get together, there was a lot of sharing going on.
It's interesting because studies have really played out your story, that the amount of digital transformation that had been going on or had been planned prior to the pandemic hitting was either stagnated and then accelerated, or accelerated throughout that activity. And I think there's still a bunch of pent-up demand. Mark, I was struck by your comment about small companies, and we think about them as being a place where innovation happens. Do you think we're about to release that innovation, that it's there and has been waiting, or how do you think about that?
Well, it's funny. I follow the investment and the venture capital community a lot right now, and there is more money waiting on the sidelines today, looking to invest in small companies. So that's a roundabout way of answering your question. That I think what I'm seeing is there's a lot of new innovation happening right now, and I just wrote an article yesterday for Forbes on this, but there's a lot of innovation being fostered out of the federal government now, which is, it hasn't happened like this in a long time.
In a long time, yeah.
With the infrastructure plan, there was an announcement out of the White House last week that DHS, CISA, and DOE are going to work collaboratively in a public-private partnership model with the electricity industry to look at ways to innovate the grid and basically enhance the grid against a lot of the cyber threats that we're seeing today. So the answer is yes. It's like there are so many startups or so many people. I probably talk at least with at least one or two people every week that's saying, I have this idea, what should I do? So I think there's a lot of interesting things coming out, not to get caught up on too many buzzwords, but AI and ML and the cloud are literally they're burning the house down. So there's a lot of exciting things happening right now. And I think to your earlier point, the last 12 months where it was slowed down for a lot of reasons, now it's like it's blowing out. So I think it's going to be an exciting next year or two or three.
So Terry, you're on this roller coaster, right? Where things were going well, you stopped sailing. Now you're having to make really, really sharp prioritization decisions. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about prioritizing, how the uncertainty either helped or hindered, and what kind of risk characterizations and conversations were you able to have?
That's a very complex question because there was a lot of conversations. Initially, we thought we'd be down for maybe 6 weeks, and here we are. Really, what had happened, right? We have a good, strong leadership team, and there was conversations with them on once it passed 6 or 8 weeks. How do we do this? Do we keep the lights on? Do we just focus on that, minimize the impacts to our guests as well as our employees? And those conversations happened every 2 to 3 weeks. Security was fortunate enough to be part of those, right? Because obviously we don't want to, let our guard down during something like this. And so we were prioritized pretty well in comparison to some of the other groups, right? Because they didn't really cut our resources and they didn't really cut our budget because they knew the importance of what we were doing to protect the guests and protect the company. But we did have to prioritize, right? A lot of the capital expenditures were cut back or refocused to other things that were more tactical. Much like Mike, we had already undertook a number of projects that was improving our infrastructure, making it better for going, forward. And so we expedited that, right? We put the capital that we're going to expend on other things into that to finish that, to make our entire workforce, work from home. So there was that, but communication was key. The leadership team met with employees every 2 weeks by virtual meeting, right? This is where we're at. This is what we're doing. And so that helped ease some of the fears with it. Some of it is, luck or blessing or whatever you want to call it, right? We had enough things in motion that we were able to adapt. And I was using that word before, right? We're adjusting to things. And Royal is flexible enough to try to pivot when we had to. And I think they did a pretty decent job in general, what we had and what we had to face.
I think, Mike, you faced the opposite, right? Where all of a sudden you had an abundance of riches in terms of business. How did you think about, how did that risk conversation go and security in the context of that?
So I've always been a part of a conversation with leadership around broad enterprise risk. And one thing that this year brought that was completely new and unexpected was the pandemic affected all of us. If you kind of go on the Wayback Machine, it affected all of us regionally in different ways. We operate in all different regions. We operate in a number of different states. The states each had a response. And so we had some states that we operate, Pennsylvania, California, they shut everybody down in a hard lockdown and made us shut our plants down right at a time when demand was pretty good for us. And then, things kind of even took off after that. So we had, as a company, we had to kind of adapt. We had to do some interesting things business-wise. I ended up being very engaged in collecting all sorts of data from different data sources that were out there about relative pandemic risk and what kind of cases are happening. We also got heavily engaged in messaging people because we had this thing that was a security awareness training platform, but it became a training platform for other things because we could kind of certify people had been through education. We had to educate people about masks and social distancing and all sorts of things. We implemented some protocols around, are you safe to come to work? Have you been exposed in your home outside of work? There was just a ton of things coming at us. And so we had this blessing, if you want to call it that, of a surge in demand. We needed to keep our associates safe and keep bringing them to work so that we could keep making product. And all that was on top of an unprecedented amount of phishing and worry and just people feeling very provoked by events in their lives. And so now they get, the phishing email or they get the thing that tries to provoke a response and they're already stressed. So it's been a very challenging year. And I'm feeling like we were blessed not to have ended up in the headlines in a bad way. We had a number of large suppliers, by the way, that did get jacked up, and we had a cardboard box supplier, big paper company that went entirely offline for about 6 weeks during a ransomware event, couldn't run any of their factories. And oh my gosh, I'm sure you'd have seen my head on a spike if something like that had happened in any of our factories. So I'm thankful that we made those investments a little bit ahead of time and avoided the worst case that some people had happen.
Yeah, I'm struck by your comments and something I know, Mark, you have been writing about and that John Simoni at Dell is very focused on, and that's the power of a converged security team. Here. And Mike, you've made the case for how a converged security team supported you through this activity, right? Leveraging the cybersecurity platform for physical security and safety benefits.
Yeah. And that's been very much a part of who we are as a company. We're a manufacturer in a capital intense industry. Information technology as a whole is an extra cost item, not something that really can drive much profit. But on the good side, because we've been very consolidated and very integrated into what the business does, as we've done these different things, when we did our big new SAP, when we did the networking needed to do barcode labeling in all my plants, when we did those things, we made sure we architected it and we built it to be secure by design and then deployment. And so each time we get a chance to do that, we inject it in and away we go. And then our team, again, is just very tied into what the business is doing. So it keeps us in a close partnership.
That alignment with business, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
Oh, please, Mark.
Bobby, I wanted to just jump in there also. You mentioned convergence. This is something that we've been talking about in security for a long time, and when I was at NERC is when the first time it really came home to me. Is one of the utilities had a security incident out in a field at a substation. They knew that the substation was offline, but the CSO was not talking to the CISO, who was not talking to the physical security guys. So this substation was offline, but they didn't know who to send. They didn't know if they should send a guy with a gun or a guy with a wrench or a guy with a laptop. So, that's the first time this convergence came to me. And I think, over the past year, working with a number of very large companies, COVID has provided an additional impetus to that. So now you have HR involved here. HR is trying to figure out what employees have been affected, or what employees have potentially been affected, what employees have been to locations where they may have been affected, and what employees do we have to have come into the office. So tying in the physical and logical identity of people it's never been more important than right now. And companies trying to figure out how they converge all this data, how they can take badge data and entry data and login data, and how they can tie this all together to give them kind of this common operating picture of what's happening in their environment has been really profound. And a couple of the companies that I work with have done really well. They've transitioned really quickly into developing technologies that satisfies these needs. As Mike said, mentioned SAP. SAP has really been kind of leading out on their technology, their ERP technology, being able to tie and bring all this stuff together. So it's been an exciting time from a technology perspective in that way. And this convergence, is I've been a proponent forever, because the efficiencies are obvious, and the cost savings are, instead of having 3 siloed security teams, you have one security team with perhaps 2 or 3 disciplines within that security team. But the fact is they're all communicating and talking better together now.
And I think the inclusion of business continuity or enterprise resilience in that team is even more important, right? Because when I think about the cyber-related events that we're having to deal with, Mike, your comment about a site with a ransomware attack that took it down, if you silo your business continuity away from that becomes, I think, an inefficiency that's a part of it. So I think that's equally an important element. But a slight pivot, though, because I think we've talked a lot about companies who've had the resources to really focus on the challenges. Wendy Nather has this concept of the security poverty line. And Mark, you've talked about the Fortune 500 and the unfortunate 5,000. How do you, it strikes me when we talk about the haves and the have-nots, that the last year has really exacerbated this line here. And how do you think about approaches for the next year from this, Mark?
Yeah, so, Bobby, from our days working at DHS, this was one of the challenges. The Fortune 500 get all of the oxygen. If there's a security incident at a Fortune 500 company, it's on the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post the next day. But if you're in, and this is not intended to be a derogatory term in any way, but if you're part of the unfortunate 5,000, not only don't you get the visibility, which could actually be a good thing in some cases, but you don't necessarily get the resources. The companies aren't typically as maybe forward thinking as some of the Fortune 500s, where they actually are putting money and investing in. So I think your comment about the security poverty line is really astute, because Wendy Nather, I think she first coined this term back in 2017 or 18 or something like that. But it basically it meant that, companies understand their security gaps to build better awareness, but they don't have the resources or the budgets to buy and implement and manage, the security controls to actually reduce that organization. So I think, the security poverty line is actually responsible for a lot of the tech debt and the compensating controls that we see accumulating in a lot of organizations. So where do I see it going? I think, there's as I said earlier, I think there's some positive things happening. As Mike said, it was kind of a time to say, okay, some of these projects that we've had planned and we're thinking about, maybe now's a good time to do them. And a lot of companies did that. They did make some investment. They were able to do some massive shifts in technology and transformational kind of upgrades over this past year. So I think the future it has to be better because because the federal government's going to be getting more and more involved. It's just, there's no doubt about it. Whether you like regulation or not, it's coming. Mark it down. You heard it here first. We're going to see more regulation across the board on cybersecurity and privacy. And if the federal government does it right, that can be a positive thing. But if they don't, I really think they need to bring the private sector into the conversation as they start making these decisions, because there are too many unintended consequences, and we've seen far too much of that out of the government.
Yeah, so Wendy's approach talks about money, right, about resources, but she expands that concept, I think, in a really profound way. Talks about talent and influence being equally elements that are necessary. And you might have resources, but with insufficient talent or insufficient influence. The other trend I've seen a lot of over the course of this year is sort of a heating up of the talent challenges globally in this space, right? As companies have had the kind of uncertainty that they've experienced, other companies who have the riches have been able to draw that talent away. Mike or Terry, do either one of you want to sort of opine on how you see this talent challenge, particularly for organizations that can't, don't have cash to outlay to bring in the top talent into their organizations?
Sure. I'll jump in first. And we do, right? We're travel and leisure, right? We sell fun. So when you're competing against some of the big banks, right, they have what I call golden handcuffs, right? They can pay above market and get people, right? That's what they do. So we look for other ways to do this, right? We obviously, when we are sailing, we have very good perks for employees. So that's one of the selling points. That was the reason I came to the company. I love to go on cruises, and the opportunity was there. The other thing we do is we look for people coming out of the military service. We work with SkillsBridge, bring them in. That has been working very well for us throughout 2020. We brought people in. It's like an intern, but they're already a skilled technical person. They work for 6 months. Most of the time, our goal is to convert them to employees. But that's something that we're just ramping way up because it has been highly successful here. The other thing is we look for, folks out of college that maybe have some passion and some background and they're hungry to get out there and learn things. If you have the right attitude, you can train anybody. So I try to keep a few really senior people, and I try to supplement in other facets.
Yeah, so I'll pile on to Terry's last comment. That's absolutely a technique we use. I don't have the budget or the headcount allocation, if you will, to do a lot. So I have to be very careful, and I have to manage what headcount I'm allowed very well. We're kind of blessed in that Charlotte, North Carolina is a great place to live. And so if we pull someone here from somewhere else, chances are they're going to want to stay in the area and that sort of thing, which has been great. We're also in North Carolina becoming a little bit of a tech hub. So it's becoming easier to get access to tech resources. All that said, I've also had to figure out how to leverage every form of partnership known to mankind. So I've got all kinds of managed service partners. I've got consulting partners. We even have some local tech where we'll go to companies. We have a huge Microsoft presence here, and I'm very invested in them. They have people that are on their bench or interning or doing things, and you'd be amazed at how inexpensive you can access talent that's on someone else's bench. You just have to be creative, and you have to be flexible in your timing, so sometimes that works. again, we stitch it together. It's like a patchwork quilt that you hope doesn't look too bad when you're done. But that's kind of what we're doing. We try to have some lead people, architect type people that are kind of the glue that binds all this together. And that's kind of difficult. That's especially difficult to preserve. But again, something we're working on all the time, and feeling the pinch all the time. Mark mentioned it a little bit earlier too. I'm amazed at how some of my partners have leveraged AI and ML and other aspects of their tooling to where the tools are getting smarter. So, we used to only have the availability of putting human eyes on something in order to analyze and make decisions. More and more tools are getting better. I'm not going to say perfect because, again, I think AI and ML is like an untrained baby wandering around, so it can be a little dangerous sometimes. But it's interesting the progress that you see being made.
So I'm going to weave Mark's challenge about good Wi-Fi in his RV wherever he is in the world, and Mike, your comment about North Carolina. As we go forward, talent is no longer has to be so regionally oriented. How do you think about that kind of, right? How does that change the way you think about sourcing and engaging?
Well, so particularly in SAP, that's where it really sort of was a 2x4 to the forehead. We've now got talent all over the world. And the only thing a little bit stressful about that, many of the folks listening in or even on this call know that you end up with talent from Eastern Europe, talent from somewhere in Asia. And the next thing you know, you're having conference calls 24/7. So that can be a challenge. But it's amazing the availability of talent, and you can have work. I mean, we've done project work where we followed the sun with the work where teams have handed off. And that's gone amazingly well. I back a few years ago, if you told me I'd be doing this, I'd have laughed at you or maybe wanted to punch you in the nose, but here I am.
Yeah, I think we talk about this as work from home in many instances, at least for me with folks, it's almost as though I'm now living at work. Mm-hmm. And so that I think that's important. I want to then go back for a second and let's talk back about uncertainty and speed. One of the things that we all experienced was this need to be incredibly agile about the decisions we made, comfortable with the amount of uncertainty that we had in order to make those decisions. Mackenzie has commented that this isn't going to go away like a normal crisis, and that we're going to have to continue in this higher speed environment, that the 12-month planning cycle now feels like it's 6 months or 4 months or even 3 months. How do you see that impacting your ability to build a viable long-term security program?
So that's a tough question.
Well, that's why you're the experts, right?
Yeah,
this is the problem that everybody listening is facing.
One thing we've done, we do our level best to be in a framework kind of approach, and then within that broader framework to be very agile and to adapt. And I think that's one of my big lessons learned out of this year, because you go in, you think you have a year or more plan ahead of you. You go into the year like the one we've just survived, and you realize how crazy that idea was. And I'm not really sure that we'll get to go back to the way it once was anymore. I think we'll have to be way more adaptable, way more agile in our approaches, and willing to get unexpected data or events that arrive and then deal with them as we go. But having said that, there exists a body of knowledge. Most of the good frameworks out there, we're very much an adherent to some of the CIS framework. The frameworks absolutely give you a core set of guides that you need to be following, even as you kind of hop around to address something that's emergent and urgent.
So We have about 5 minutes left. I want to give you each the chance to sort of leave our audience with this question. And Mark, let's start with you. What is the sort of single COVID-19 related security trend that worries you the most?
Yeah, well, I guess my answer is probably not anything that you would think it is, but I think that misinformation and disinformation and fraud that's the biggest threat that I see right now. You know, we've gone through so much with COVID and with vaccines and with the elections and everything that's happened in the United States in the past year. I think people have become they've become very distrustful of almost everything and everyone. And that's not good for society. I mean, you know, we have people arguing with experts now because of something they read on Google, they saw on Google that, you know, that contradicted what an expert said. So I think, you know, misinformation and disinformation, COVID spawned a lot of these things that are going to be hard to recover from. I'm not sure, quite frankly, how we put the genie back in the bottle and we, you know, I guess healthy paranoia is good, but I think we've crossed over maybe a little bit too far. So that's what worries me the most.
Harry?
I do like what Mark said about misinformation, because I think that is 100% spot on. There's a lot of that. I think that strictly from an incident response perspective, what we're looking at is a huge increase of phishing attacks, very complex ones in many times, and ransomware associated with those. So that worries me, right? We saw a huge spike during 2020, about 500% increase of unique attacks. So that's got us on our guard, but we've also taken, other considerations around it using AI and some automation that we didn't have prior. So we're trying to accommodate the best we can. But definitely that's going to continue, right? As long as there's some fear and misinformation out there, people will be trying to take money or advantage of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Mike.
So I guess trying to stitch together a little bit about what the other panelists have said, I'm very worried that we're seeing an increase in crime as a business inside cyber warfare in a way. So I'm not so worried about nation state attacks as much as I am the fact that there are nations in the world where you can make a really good living as a cyber criminal. And then there's almost a network of cyber crime out there working against us. And it feels like this year they've really ramped it up. And then at the same time, to tie back to what Mark said, I've got people that are struggling and under stress and very responsive to the buttons those guys push. And so all those things really worry me going forward.
Yeah, I think as much as we spend time as security professionals thinking about the technologies that we need to put in place, this year I think has reminded all of us that this is a very human business and a very human set of experiences that are there. And I think for me, one of the key themes I heard from everybody was that people remain our most important resource, and that our focus on their care and their contribution and their innovations is really a vital element. So I really appreciate your time today. I look forward to continued discussion on this topic. I think, like you all, I'm optimistic about the year ahead, but I'm skeptical as well, because there are many places where it could go either way. And so I'm happy to have you all on the team and good partnership going forward.
Yeah, great conversation. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Bobby.